In the cold mists of medieval Scotland, when the highlands were wild and the lowlands fractured, there came a queen unlike any other, a woman whose piety softened, warriors whose wisdom tamed kings, and whose lineage traced back to both Anglo-Saxon saints and the blood of Alfred the Great. Her name was Margaret, daughter of exile, queen of the Scots, mother of dynasties, and in time a saint of Christendom. But her life was no tranquil legend. It began amid fire and exile and ended in grief beside the tomb of her slain husband. Her story is the story of a world on the edge, between Viking raids and Norman conquest, between the fading glory of Anglo-Saxon England and the fierce awakening of a new Scottish nation. Margaret was born around 1045 in Hungary, far from the misty isles that would one day be hers. Her father, Edward the Exile, was a prince of the old English royal line, a descendant of Edmund Ironside and Alfred the Great. When the Danes conquered England in the early 11th century, Edward's family was driven abroad, finding refuge first in Scandinavia, and later in the court of King Stephen I of Hungary. It was there that Margaret's story began, a princess born not in a palace of gold, but in a foreign court where memory was her inheritance and loss her first lesson. Her mother, Agatha, is said to have been of noble Eastern birth, possibly related to the German emperors or the Kiev and Rus. Margaret was raised in the Hungarian court alongside her siblings, including her brother Edgar Theling, who would later be hailed as the last Anglo-Saxon heir to the English throne. Her youth was marked by learning and devotion. Educated in Latin, scripture, and courtly manners, Margaret was a child of two worlds, the old Christian East and the restless West. But in 1057, when her father was invited back to England by Edward the Confessor, fate shifted once again. In 1057, Edward the Exile returned to England, welcomed as a potential successor to the childless Edward the Confessor. But within weeks of arriving, he mysteriously died, leaving his young children, Margaret, Christina, and Edgar, once again adrift in a kingdom of uncertain loyalties. When Harold Godwinson seized the throne in 1066, the exiled royal family's hopes dimmed. Then came William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings, where Anglo-Saxon England was lost forever. As Norman knights swept across the land, the royal exiles fled north, seeking sanctuary. Tradition holds that they boarded a ship intending to return to the continent, but the wind drove them instead to the rugged shores of Scotland. There, amid sea spray and heather, they found refuge at the court of King Malcolm III of Scotland, known as Malcolm Canmore, the great warrior king who had spent his youth fighting the same Danes and Northumbrians who had shaped Margaret's ancestors. Fate, it seemed, had brought together a warrior without peace and a princess without a home. Malcolm was everything Margaret was not: fierce, broad-shouldered, a man of the sword. He had ruled Scotland since 1058, his throne secured by blood and battle. His English was rough, his manners rougher. Yet in Margaret he saw something he lacked: gentleness, wisdom, and faith. The chronicles say that Margaret at first resisted his proposals. She had wanted to dedicate her life to the church, perhaps to become a nun. But Malcolm's persistence and the urging of her family persuaded her. They were married around 1070 in the royal seat of Dunfermline. That union would change Scotland forever. Their marriage was, by all accounts, one of rare harmony. Malcolm adored his queen. Chroniclers describe him as illiterate but deeply affectionate, a man who would sit beside her as she read from the Gospels. kissing the pages she touched. He gave her jewels and gold, but she gave him something far greater: civilization. Margaret brought the refinement of the English court to the rough-hewn kingdom. She reformed not only its politics, but its soul. She softened the manners of the nobility, established schools for children, and introduced the rituals and customs of the wider Christian world to the Scottish Church, which had grown isolated since the fall of Rome. Under her influence, the court of Dunfermline became a beacon of learning and piety. She founded the Benedictine Abbey of Dunfermline, which would become Scotland's royal mausoleum for generations to come. She also built churches, hospitals, and the famous Queen's Ferry across the Forth to ease the journey of pilgrims traveling to St. Andrews. But perhaps her greatest legacy was her religious reform. The Scottish Church of the 11th century had drifted from Roman practice. Old Celtic customs lingered. Easter was celebrated on a different date. Priests married, fasting rules were lax. Margaret, deeply schooled in Roman orthodoxy, called councils of bishops and priests, where she debated theological issues with precision and grace. Her reforms aligned the Scottish Church with Rome, a step that would integrate Scotland into the broader Christian world and lay the foundation for centuries of ecclesiastical order. Her husband Malcolm supported her wholeheartedly, though he himself remained a man of simple faith. He built churches at her request, distributed alms, and enforced her reforms by royal decree. It was said that while he could not read, he understood the holiness in her eyes, and that her prayers could calm his temper better than any sword. Margaret bore 8 children, 6 sons, and 2 daughters, a dynasty that would shape the future of Britain. Among them were Edgar, Alexander I, and David I, all future kings of Scotland. Her daughter Matilda, or Edith, would marry King Henry I of England, uniting Norman and Saxon bloodlines and laying the groundwork for the Plantagenet and Tudor monarchies. Through her children, Margaret became the matriarch of the British royal line, the spiritual and genealogical link between the lost world of Anglo-Saxon England and the emerging nations of medieval Europe. But her own life was nearing its end. In 1093, as England and Scotland clashed along their turbulent border, Malcolm led his army south to besiege Alnwick Castle. There he was ambushed and slain along with their eldest son, Edward. The news reached Margaret at Edinburgh Castle, where she lay gravely ill. According to the chronicler Turgot of Durham, her confessor and later biographer, she whispered only one prayer: "I thank thee, Lord, that thou hast sent me this sorrow in expiation of my sins." Within 3 days of hearing of her husband's death, Queen Margaret died on November 16, 1093, at the age of 48. It was said that as she died, a strange calm fell upon the castle, and that even the warriors outside laid down their arms in silence. Her sons buried her beside Malcolm at Dunfermline Abbey, the church she had built with her own hands and heart. A century later, in 1250, she was canonized by Pope Innocent IV, becoming St. Margaret of Scotland, one of the few queens in European history to be declared a saint. Her feast day, November 16th, remains one of Scotland's most sacred. Her reforms endured for generations: the alignment of the Scottish Church with Rome, the founding of schools and abbeys, the integration of Anglo-Saxon and Gaelic cultures, and the civilizing influence that transformed a warrior kingdom into a Christian realm. Even the mighty Robert the Bruce and Mary, Queen of Scots, centuries later would pray at her shrine, seeking her intercession in times of peril. And when Queen Victoria restored the chapel of St. Margaret at Edinburgh Castle in the 19th century, it was in homage to the woman who had once turned a fortress of war into a sanctuary of faith. In the end, St. Margaret's story is not merely one of piety, it is the saga of transformation. She took a wild land and taught it grace. She took a fierce king and taught him mercy. She took the wreckage of exile and turned it into the foundation of a dynasty that would rule Britain for nearly 1,000 years. The Anglo-Saxons had lost their kingdom, but through Margaret, their spirit endured. The Vikings had conquered the north, but through her children, Christendom reclaimed it. In her, the last light of old England met the dawn of Scotland's golden age. And from her, the bloodline of kings and queens flowed unbroken to this very day. St. Margaret of Scotland, 1045 to 1093, the exiled princess, the reforming queen, the mother of dynasties, and the saint who civilized a kingdom.